Hi, this is Matt Baker. Welcome to episode 5 in my series on Christian denominations. Today, I'll mostly be talking about the Baptists and the Methodists, two groups that are closely connected to a period of religious change known as the First Great Awakening. There were actually at least 3 Great Awakenings in total, all of which took place primarily in the English-speaking world. I'll be covering the second one in episode 6 and the third one in episode 7. So basically, the next 3 episodes of this series will be focused on the 3 Great Awakenings and the various denominations that came out of them. And once again, I want to shout out Joshua from the YouTube channel Ready to Harvest. I relied heavily on him for this episode in particular because he happens to be a Baptist himself. However, he's also produced his own video about the Baptists, which I recommend that you watch after this one, as he does a good job at breaking down all the various different types of Baptists, of which there are many. As usual, let me begin by pointing out a few changes that I've made to the chart since last time. If you've watched the previous episodes, you'll know that I've been building this chart as I go, and that sometimes I incorporate suggestions from comments. Well, one thing that several people wanted was an Others section, so I went ahead and added one at the bottom. However, I also added a few other sections as well. For example, not all Lutherans belong to the Lutheran World Federation, but rather than include those Lutherans at the bottom, I included them here as other Lutherans. Likewise, I added other Pentecostals next to the Assemblies of God in order to make it clear just how many Pentecostals there are in the world, even though most of them do not belong to a single denomination or ecumenical organization. In fact, if all the Pentecostals were to create a worldwide communion, they would rank above the Eastern Orthodox Church as the second largest Christian communion in the world. Finally, I also added other Baptists, as only about half of the Baptists worldwide belong to the Baptist World Alliance. Again, if all the Baptists in the world did unite, they'd be much higher on the list, coming in just above the Anglicans. Now, the reason why there is no Other Methodists section and no Other Reformed section is because in these two cases, virtually all Methodists belong to the Methodist World Council, and virtually all Reformed churches belong to the World Council of Reformed Churches. So there's not really any Other Methodists or Other Reformed to mention. There are other Anglicans, but at least for now, they number less than 1 million. So I opted not to show them since on this infographic, each church symbol is supposed to represent around 10 million members. Okay, there were some comments about the world map as well. For example, several people pointed out that Lebanon should be yellow, since that country is more than 10% Christian and Catholicism is the dominant type there. So, although it's hard to see, Lebanon is now yellow. Germany and Australia were mentioned as well, since both of those countries are split around 50-50 between Catholics and Protestants, with Catholics starting to take the edge in both places. But I'm going to do a bit more research into the most recent stats before making a final decision. In the family tree section, there's just one thing to point out. Many people requested that the Shakers be added, so I've gone ahead and done that. Their founder was an early Quaker, so I've shown them as splitting off before the other major Quaker groups were formed. Okay, let's now look at the Baptists. The Baptists, along with the Quakers and the Congregationalists, were among the many English separatist groups that left the Church of England in the 1600s. However, as I mentioned last time, most of the other groups, such as the Diggers, Enthusiasts, Ranters, Seekers, and Muggletonians, have since gone extinct. The Quakers have always been a relatively small group, and the Congregationalists, although once a large group, are today relatively small, meaning that it's mostly the Baptists who are the modern-day descendants of the English separatists. The two men usually credited with having started the Baptist movement are John Smith and Thomas Helwys, both former Anglicans. They ended up moving to Holland where they crossed paths with the Anabaptists and became convinced that Christians should be baptized as adults, not infants. This is why the Baptists are sometimes shown on charts as being an offshoot of the Anabaptists. However, while early interaction did take place, and while they did share one big thing in common, the idea that baptism should be for adults only, or at least older children, the two groups quickly ended up going in very different directions. And thus, I think it's better to see the Baptists as being an offshoot of the Anglicans rather than the Anabaptists. Now, in some Baptist circles, there's actually another hypothesis about Baptist origins. But before I dive into it, I want to point out that many Christian traditions have alternative views on their origins, views that often differ from the more academic narrative that I've been sharing in this series. For example, the Roman Catholic Church sees themselves as being the one true church, going all the way back to the Apostle Peter, who they see as being the first pope. In the Catholic view, everyone else split off from them, including the Eastern Orthodox churches. However, the Eastern Orthodox Church holds the opposite view. They see themselves as being the one true church, and they see the Roman Catholics and Protestants as being misguided offshoots. Even some Anglicans like to see their church as having an origin that predates the Roman Catholic Church. These Anglicans would say that the Church of England can claim an unbroken descent from much earlier Celtic churches that were planted in the first century. So my point is that the Baptists are by no means unique when it comes to having an origin story that treats their particular tradition as being special. Anyhow, according to some Baptists, known as landmark Baptists, the Baptist tradition did not start in the 1600s, but rather can be traced all the way back to the first century through a series of fringe movements. This chart from the 1931 book, The Trail of Blood, illustrates the idea. At the top, you can see the mainstream churches, including the original state-sponsored church that eventually split into the Greek and Roman branches, with the Roman branch eventually including the various Protestant groups as well. The red dots, which make up a trail of blood, represent congregations of quote-unquote true churches that, according to landmarkism, would have been similar to Baptist churches today. And at the bottom, there's a steady line of red dots, meaning that in certain areas there existed a direct continuity between the first century churches and the Baptists that eventually settled in America. Note that there's a large gray area marked the Dark Ages, where the trail of blood is associated with certain fringe groups such as the Paulicians and the Waldensians. Which brings me to this part of the chart, because the Paulicians were in fact a real historical branch of early Christianity. Not much is known about them for certain, but they originally popped up in Armenia in the 600s. Most scholars think that they probably ended up influencing the Bogomils, who emerged in Bulgaria in the 900s, and that the Bogomils, in turn, influenced the Cathars, who emerged in southern France in the 1100s. Also emerging in southern France in the 1100s were the Waldensians, a group of proto-Protestants that I mentioned in episode 3. So, according to the landmark hypothesis, the quote-unquote true church can be traced from the Paulicians in the Middle East all the way to the Waldensians in France, and then from there, through the Anabaptists to the Baptists in America today. Now, it probably won't surprise you to learn that I don't agree with this hypothesis at all, nor do most religious scholars, nor do even most Baptists. The general consensus is that the Paulicians, Bogomils, and Cathars probably practiced some sort of Gnosticism, and that therefore they do not relate to the Baptists at all. So let's now return to what we know about Baptists from verifiable history. Early on, there emerged two main types of Baptists: particular Baptists and general Baptists. Basically, particular Baptists are Calvinists, whereas general Baptists are not. And the reason why both types are able to coexist is because Baptists follow a Congregationalist form of church government, meaning that each congregation is basically independent and can decide their own theology. However, that doesn't mean that they are the same as the Congregationalists, shown over here as part of the Reformed tradition. The Congregationalists practice infant baptism, whereas Baptists do not. The First Baptist congregation in what is today the U.S. was founded by Roger Williams in 1638. As I mentioned last time, most of the New England colonies had Congregationalism as their state religion, and therefore Baptists were not allowed. Because of this, Roger Williams helped establish what is now the state of Rhode Island, so that Baptists and other Christians could have a place where they could freely practice their faith. Eventually, the congregation that he started there built this building, which stands to this day and which is known as the First Baptist Church in America. Prior to 1730, the Baptists were actually a fairly small group within American Christianity. However, that all changed with the First Great Awakening. By this point, some Christian leaders felt that Protestantism had become too intellectual. While they still felt that it was important to get one's theology right, which was the whole point of the Protestant Reformation in the first place, they also felt that Christianity at its core should be a religion of the heart. This idea had shown up in continental Europe a bit earlier as pietism, but hadn't really taken off yet in the English-speaking world. But then came the First Great Awakening. Basically, the First Great Awakening can be seen as the start of what we today call evangelical Christianity. Unlike the more liturgical forms of Christianity, which focus more on communal rituals, evangelical Christianity is more focused on the individual conversion experience. In more recent times, this experience is often described as being born again. What happened during the First Great Awakening is that many preachers, such as Jonathan Edwards, started to preach more about the need for each person to repent of their sins and to receive the gift of salvation through belief in Jesus. This led many churches to become more interested in missionary work, which refers to trying to convince other people to become born again as well. Thus, among Baptists, the initial division that existed between particular Baptists and general Baptists became less important, with most Baptists unifying to become missionary Baptists, and those who did not support mission boards becoming known as primitive Baptists. Primitive Baptists are very much in the minority today, and the only primitive Baptist church that you're likely to have heard of is the infamous Westboro Baptist Church, the group known for picketing funerals and for promoting hatred towards gay people. However, let me be clear in saying that they are by no means representative of all primitive Baptists. I simply mention them because they show up in the media quite a bit. Now, one of the results of the First Great Awakening is that Christianity really started to grow among Black Americans for the first time, both among those who were enslaved in the South as well as among free Blacks in the North. Most Black Americans thus ended up joining either the Baptist movement or the Methodist movement, which we'll get to in a bit. In the South, Black Baptists were originally required to have white ministers. However, after emancipation, the first Black-led churches started to form. Now, I should point out that because all Baptist congregations are technically independent, there's really no such thing as denominations in the Baptist tradition. Instead, Baptists have conventions, which are state-level or national-level organizations that individual congregations can affiliate with, if they so choose. However, at the end of the day, they are actually quite similar to denominations, so I'm just going to use that word going forward. So the earliest still existing Black Baptist convention to be formed in the U.S. was the National Baptist Convention USA, established in 1895. Today, it is the largest historically Black church in America. However, in 1915, some churches split off to form the similarly named National Baptist Convention of America, or NBCA. And then in 1961, a different set of churches split off to form the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a member of. Finally, in 1988, a group of churches split off from the NBCA to form the National Baptist Missionary Convention of America. So note that all four of these denominations have very similar sounding names, but don't get them confused because they are actually all different. As you might have guessed, the progressive National Baptists are more progressive, whereas the other three tend to be more conservative. In terms of white American Baptists, most of the missionary Baptists eventually formed the Triennial Convention in 1814. However, because of disputes over slavery, this eventually split into the Northern Baptist Convention and the Southern Baptist Convention. Although, note that the Northern Convention continued to use the triennial name until 1907. Nowadays, the Northern Convention is known as the American Baptist Churches USA, and they tend to be more liberal, whereas the Southern Baptist Convention has kept its original name and tends to be more conservative. I should also point out that the Southern Baptist Convention is currently the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., with approximately 14 million members. This is smaller than the number of Catholics in the U.S., which is around 70 million, but keep in mind that when all Protestant churches are combined, Protestants in the U.S. do outnumber Catholics. Now, besides the Southern Baptists and the other groups I've mentioned so far, there are still several more Baptist denominations to mention. For instance, there's the National Association of Free Will Baptists, Free Will Baptists being another name for general or non-Calvinist Baptists. Then there's the American Baptist Association, which is a landmark Baptist group that holds to the trail of blood explanation of Baptist origins that I mentioned above. But perhaps most important are the so-called independent Baptist groups, out of which the Baptist Bible Fellowship International is the largest. This is the denomination that Jerry Falwell was originally attached to. Falwell is known for having founded the Moral Majority, which during the 1980s grew to become a major political lobby group for evangelical Christians, and which laid the groundwork for right-wing Christians to have more influence at the national level, something that continues to this day. As I mentioned earlier, the northern-based American Baptist churches went in a more liberal direction, whereas the Southern Baptists went in a more conservative direction. This led to the Conservative Baptist Association splitting off from the ABC in 1947 because they didn't like that the ABC was so liberal. Note that they recently changed their name to the Venture Church Network. However, in contrast, there's also the Cooperative Baptist Association that split off from the SBC because they didn't like that the SBC was so conservative. Finally, there's Converge, formerly known as the Baptist General Conference, and even further back as the Swedish Baptist General Conference. They have their roots in the Scandinavian Free Churches that also produced the Evangelical Covenant Church and the Evangelical Free Church. Now, I should point out that although I've focused only on U.S. Baptists, there are in fact Baptists all over the world. However, since most of those churches were planted by American missionaries, I thought it was best to focus on the U.S. ones. The one exception to this are the Baptists in the UK, who, like the American Baptists, can trace their origins all the way back to Smith and Hellis. Nowadays, most Baptists in the UK belong to a denomination called Baptists Together. It was also in the UK that the Seventh-day Baptists originated. I'll mention them again next time when I talk about the Adventists. Okay, let's now talk about the Methodists. Whereas the Baptists existed before the First Great Awakening, the Methodists did not. And in fact, it was because of the First Great Awakening that the Methodists were formed. The three big names associated with the founding of Methodism are John Wesley, his brother Charles Wesley, and their friend George Whitefield, all former Anglicans. Like many denominational founders, they didn't initially set out to make a new denomination. It just sort of happened. During their youth, they started a group at Oxford called the Holy Club, in which members methodically strove to incorporate Christianity into every part of their life. Other students made fun of them and called them Methodists, a term that stuck and which later became the official name for the movement. In 1739, after having done missionary work in the Americas and having come into contact with the Moravians, whom I mentioned in episode 3, the trio started to preach throughout England in unconventional ways, including outside in the open air. This attracted many working class people who had not previously been regular churchgoers. While Whitfield's theology was Calvinist, John Wesley's was not. He emphasized that salvation was available to everyone, and in particular focused on something called the second work of grace. According to Methodist theology, the first work of grace is the initial conversion experience of being born again, whereas the second work of grace is the process by which a Christian is transformed into becoming a more perfect and holy person. Just a few years after John Wesley's death, the first two Methodist denominations were formed, one in the US and one in the UK. In the US, it was called the Methodist Episcopal Church, in order to distinguish it from the Episcopal Church, which had become independent from the Anglican Church just 10 years earlier. Eventually, the US Methodists split in two over slavery, just like the Baptists did. But unlike the Baptists, the two groups eventually reunited in 1939, which is when they became known simply as the Methodist Church. Then in 1968, it merged with the Evangelical United Brethren Church to become the United Methodist Church, which is the main Methodist denomination in the U.S. today. In fact, it is the second largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. after the Southern Baptists. However, recently it has experienced another schism, this time over the ordination of gay and lesbian clergy. In 2022, the more conservative Global Methodist Church was formed, and to date, at least 1,000 congregations have left the United Methodist Church to join it. The split is still very fresh, so it's yet to be seen where all the chips will fall. Like the Baptists, Black American Methodists formed their own denominations early on. So in the early 1800s in the North, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME, was formed in Philadelphia, and the AME Zion Church was formed in New York. To this day, they have remained separate, but as far as I can tell, there's not a lot of theological differences between the two. Then, after the Civil War, a third Black Methodist denomination was formed, this time in the South. It was originally called the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, but nowadays is called the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. Okay, also separating from the original Methodist denomination in the U.S. was the Wesleyan Church in 1843 and the Free Methodist Church in 1860. They are both aligned with the Holiness movement, which grew out of the Second and Third Great Awakenings, which I'll talk more about in future episodes. For now, I'll simply point out that these two Methodist denominations are, generally speaking, more conservative than the much larger United Methodist Church. In the UK, the main Methodist denomination was originally known as the Wesleyan Methodist Church. However, there were many smaller denominations that broke off from it to form independent denominations. However, in 1932, most of these merged back with the main denomination to form what is now simply called the Methodist Church of Great Britain. The well-known Salvation Army denomination has its roots in British Methodism as well, but is aligned more with the Holiness movement. So again, I'll talk more about them in a future episode. However, I do want to mention two other churches that have strong connections to Methodism. First, there's the United Church of Canada, which is the largest Protestant denomination in Canada, which is where I'm from. It formed in 1925 from a merger between three Christian groups in Canada: the Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. The Methodists were the largest of the three groups, which is why I've decided to include the United Church of Canada here with the Methodists, rather than with the Reformed churches. Being a Canadian, their logo is something that is immediately recognizable to me, since I see it a lot on church signs. What I didn't know until I started doing research for this video is that 3 of the 4 symbols represent the 3 traditions that merged back in 1925. The dove is a common symbol used by Methodists. The burning bush is a common symbol used by Presbyterians. And the open Bible represents the Congregationalists. The final symbol, the Alpha and the Omega, is a symbol for Jesus. And the 4 colors used in the design, white, red, yellow, and black, are colors often associated with Indigenous Canadians. In Australia, there is a similar church, known as the Uniting Church of Australia. It too formed from a merger between Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Methodists. I'm not sure if the Methodists make up the largest component in this case, so maybe someone in the comments can let me know. Finally, I want to point out 2 more united churches that I've added to the chart, this time in the Anglican section, as in these 2 cases, it was the Anglicans who were the largest components. In 1927, Anglicans in India became independent as the Church of India, Burma, and Ceylon. However, after the country itself achieved independence, the Anglicans in South India merged with the Methodists, as well as with the South India United Church, which was itself a union of Congregationalists and Presbyterians. The new United Church was called the Church of South India, and to this day it is the largest Protestant denomination in South Asia. The Church of North India was formed later in 1970, but basically it too represents a merger of Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. Okay, so that was a look at the Baptists and Methodists, as well as the First Great Awakening. Next time, we'll be covering the Second Great Awakening, which resulted in several new branches on the tree, including the Restorationists, the Latter-day Saints, the Adventists, and the Plymouth Brethren. Thanks for watching.